Hello everyone and welcome. This is Gon here again, bringing you another Kerbal Space Program video. And you can see here that I'm currently constructing a rocket in the vehicle assembly building. I decided to go with a rocket this time instead of an SSTO because, SSTOs are a little bit difficult. Sometimes you just want to build a rocket and fly it somewhere, and generally that's a little bit easier to do, at least for me, so you can see me building it here. This is going to be an Apollo style mission. So this little bit here that you see is going to be a lander. So we're going to be landing on the surface of Vall. I decided to go to Vall today. I haven't been to Vall in a while, and I figured, it's a planet that, well, it's a moon of a planet in Kerbal Space Program that, sometimes goes a little bit forgotten. You don't really see much happen with Vall a whole lot. So I decided to show Vall some love today and take a visit. And of course, we'll be taking Valentina Kerman with us to do the obligatory Vall on Vall. And so now you can see here I'm just constructing the sort of transfer ship that will push everything along. So I said it's a Apollo-style mission, meaning that there's going to be a separate lander that will go down on the surface while a ship remains in orbit above. But in this case, you can see I've sort of put the lander on top instead of having, like they actually did in the real Apollo mission, having the lander kind of below the, the command module that actually went to the moon. And they did this sort of reconfiguration in orbit where the command module sort of staged away from the booster vehicle, then turned around and redocked with the lunar module and pulled it out of the ascent stage. But here I've sort of put the lander on top. I just find that in KSP that's a little bit easier to do, to put the lander on top, mainly because it typically weighs less, and so you sort of have less mass at the very top of the rocket, so it tends to be a little bit more stable when you're launching it off of Kerbin in the first place. So for that reason, and for others as well, it's just the logistics of getting a separate rocket sort of below your engines can be a little bit tricky, kind of depending on how you do it. So I just put it up there on top. It's just a little bit easier, Kerbal Space Program, a lot of things are just easier to do certain ways and make more sense. So you can see here we've constructed the rocket, quite a large fairing up top there. It's a very long sort of vessel ship. You can see the name up there. I've called it the Rustler Mark I because, sometimes your jimmies get rustled when you're a Kerbal. I don't know. And you also notice I put all the science kits on the lander there, so we'll be doing some science on Vall. I mean, this is a science save. It's not a career or not a sandbox save, but and here we go. Just launching off from the pad there. But yeah, we'll be collecting some science. In this particular save, I've already unlocked the entire tech tree, so I don't really need science. This is more just for demonstration purposes to show you, what could be possible. So, hopefully this could serve as potentially a bit of a tutorial, because as you may know, if you play Kerbal Space Program regularly, Vall is a moon of Jool, and Jool is one of the more difficult places to get to. It's not as tough as Elu, and actually, ironically, is not as tough as Moho either. Moho is probably one of the most difficult places to actually get to. And Jool is probably about as difficult to get to as Drez, depending. It might be actually a little bit easier to get to than Drez, but doesn't necessarily require quite as much fuel for the initial injection burn to get there, although Drez requires typically a lot more fuel to capture than Jool does, as we will see when we start planning our maneuver nodes to get to Jool, which a lot of I've sped up, so sometimes these things are sort of, you have to play around with the maneuver nodes until you get it just right, until you find out what works. Typically it's a little bit easier for Jool because it's not very inclined compared to Kerbin, whereas somewhere like Moho, even sometimes Eve, and Dres definitely are quite inclined on their orbits, so it can require sort of these huge inclination change burns that you don't typically have to deal with Jool. So you can see the rocket just getting up here to the upper atmosphere. There's just a little bit of fuel left in the lower stage there. And sort of just coasting up out of the atmosphere. I'm going to aim to get above 100 kilometers because I'm extremely lazy. And what happens is 100 kilometers tends to be a break point for time warp. So below 100 kilometers in orbit, you can't time warp as fast as you can above 100 kilometers. I think there might be a way to tweak that, but there are other reasons you want to go up a little bit higher. The atmosphere ends at 70 kilometers, so getting up to 100 kilometers is not really necessary, but in this case, for long burns, like if you're going to the outer planets, it can be useful to go ahead and put yourself into a higher orbit, because often what you'll find is if you have long burns close to Kerbin, when you start your burn, you'll actually be pointing toward the planet, and so you'll be forcing your orbit down lower, and you don't want to dip into the atmosphere if you can avoid it. So sometimes it's nicer to have a higher orbit, depending on what you're trying to do. So here we're just burning off the last bit of fuel in the lower stage, and then staging off to the second stage here, just that single Rhino engine, which has quite a good thrust to weight ratio. It puts out quite a bit of thrust and is a good vacuum optimized engine. Really suitable for larger rockets. It's quite a large engine. I think it weighs, ooh, I'm on the spot now. I think it weighs about 9 tons, if I remember right, just the engine. So it's quite a lot of dry mass to be adding to a craft. But as you can see here, we're getting our orbit not quite circular. That Rhino is actually just a little bit overpowered, honestly. But we'll go ahead and plan the maneuver to get it circularized there. And so throughout this mission I'll be using a bit of time warp, and I'll also be speeding up the video because some of it is just, you know, monotonous playing around with maneuver nodes or fiddling with trajectories or doing science. You know, I'm picking up some science because in this save I haven't actually been to Jool yet. I just unlocked the entire tech tree from the stuff around Kerbin, so Minmus, Mun, and then Duna and Ike. And that pretty much is all you need to unlock the entire tech tree. And you don't even have to visit all of Duna and Ike, just a few biomes on each one typically. If you do a pretty good job at Minmus and Mun. You might be able to unlock the entire tech tree just from Minmus and Mun if you really hit every biome or nearly every biome, but I usually don't do that. I usually try to spice it up a little bit, have some variety in there. So now we can get, you know, this isn't technically necessary. You can just transfer Kerbals between your capsules, but it's not really realistic, you know, going through the engine there and through the fuel tank. So I just kind of transferred Valentina over the typical way, doing an EVA, and then just redock these two together. And there we go. So now we're ready for the planning of the maneuver node to get to Jool. And one of the other ways that I was just really lazy is that I needed to time warp to get to a Jool transfer window. So I'm just using the mod Kerbal Alarm Clock up there in the corner to plan a maneuver node transfer window to get to Jool. And so there you can see we're just getting a Jool encounter really easily right off the bat. Jool has a huge gravitational well compared to the other planets. So it's typically easy to get an encounter, and then once I found the sort of right angle there, the correct angle to eject from Kerbin, I reduced the burn to something that wouldn't quite eject me from Kerbin yet, because as you might notice, if you see the Kerbal Engineer Redux readings at the top there, I still have quite a bit of delta V in this Rhino stage, so we're just going to burn off the rest of that fuel here, which will swing us way outside the orbit of the Mun even, and then out here we'll just deorbit the lower Rhino stage. So just do a quick burn here to get the periapsis, you know, down below the point at which it will burn up in the atmosphere, and then we can just flip the vessel around and stage into the final transfer stage of our spaceship here, which will be, I think there's 4 nuclear engines down there on an engine plate. So I had looked at 3, and 3 just didn't have quite the thrust to weight ratio I wanted. I try to keep it at least 0.25 if I can, because otherwise burns just take so long, and it's difficult to even execute them properly, especially when you're going to a place like Jool. So there we go, staging, and then we'll get the ship moving back up above the atmosphere again, take our periapsis back up to about 100 kilometers, and then plan the maneuver node for the final injection. So that piece of debris that we've left will just fall down into the atmosphere and deorbit, and we won't be leaving, don't want to be leaving any space junk in orbit around Kerbin, you know. It's not really the eco-friendly way to be doing things. So we'll just get this planned here, and you can see, oh, there we got a Jool encounter right away. Didn't even have to zoom out to get it, but we'll just take a quick look here and see if we can maybe tune that a little bit. Looks like it's a little bit off inclination, but otherwise lined up fairly well. And we're not really close to one of the ascending or descending nodes for the orbit at the moment, so we'll just correct that during the transfer. And that looks good for right now, so we'll just do a time warp on down here and prepare to start the burn. And you might notice the burn time indicator is completely bugged for whatever reason in this version of KSP. I don't really know. I mean, I don't even know what version of KSP we're on these days. I think it's 1.5 something, but whenever they did the last fairly major update, it seems to have broken the burn timer, at least in some cases. It's not always broken. There are some times when it's correct, but I haven't been able to find any consistency. So you'll see actually sometime during this mission it will be correct, and then other times it will not be correct. So whenever it shows up red like that, I just sort of have to look at the meters per second burn that's required and then just kind of guess at how long it's going to take to do the burn. So I sort of guessed, well, it'll probably take about 6 minutes or so. So I started the burn around 3 minutes away from the node. But yeah, the burn time indicator just kind of jumps around and isn't particularly accurate. Sometimes it's way off, and sometimes it's only somewhat off. And then sometimes when it's green, it's actually correct. So it looks like I was actually a little bit early with the burn. I could have waited a bit longer. But like I said, you know, we're going to Jool. It has a very large sphere of influence. It's pretty easy to hit it, so it won't be much of a problem. And that's our burn completed, so we are en route to Jool, the largest planet of the Kerbal system. Although it is a gas giant, I wouldn't recommend trying to land on it, although in earlier versions of KSP you could do that. I've seen some video of people actually descending down and then finding a place where their craft would sort of stop and come to a rest in Jool's atmosphere-ish, whatever it is. But yeah, I think these days if you try that, your craft will just get destroyed no matter what once it reaches a certain height. So with Jool, the best strategy to get to Jool, and then when you're coming in, is to use Tylo in a gravity assist to swing yourself into a Jool orbit. It's very, very fuel efficient to do this. Tylo is quite large. It has quite a big sphere of influence and has a lot of gravity to it, so you can use it quite effectively to slow yourself down relative to Jool and get into an orbit quite easily. And you can do the reverse as well, where you use Tylo to eject you out of Jool back to the inner system, although I didn't end up doing that this time, but I have done that in the past. But here we're using Tylo to capture into Jool orbit. And I noticed it's not showing me where I'm going to end up after the Tylo encounter, so I had to expand the patched conics out another step there, so I'll see where it'll end up being. And I just sort of put a maneuver node on the, which was it, the descending node, I think? Whichever one we get to before we actually reach Jool, to sort of align that. And then as I was playing around with this a little bit, you know, I discovered, since, you know, our destination is Vall, right? So I kind of wanted to match orbits with Vall. And as I was playing around with it and getting right on top of Val's orbit, oh, I actually got a Vall encounter right there, like completely just by happenstance. I had no idea I was just going to get a Vall encounter right off the bat, coming in from the Tylo encounter and swinging into orbit. But hey, you know, I will certainly take it. I don't mind that at all. So we get the Vall encounter there, and just making sure that that lines up properly. And I was taking a look at how much the Vall encounter is going to cost to get into a circular orbit as well. So now we've kind of got all that planned out, and we can go ahead and time warp up to the location where we're going to be doing that burn. Just kind of warp to next maneuver there. Not much to see out here, I just kind of left it in map view. And here we go. Not too big of a burn, just 81 meters per second. And you might have noticed this craft has way more than enough delta V to get anything done. Look at that thrust to weight ratio. It says it's 10,000 thrust to weight ratio. What? I don't understand this at all. Very strange weirdness. I think it's part of the reason the burn time is wrong as well. But anyway, here we are, just executing that burn, getting the orbit just right. And there we go. But yeah, even now I still have over 6,000 meters per second of delta V in this rocket. Completely overbuilt, but then that's sort of my style. I like to make sure I have way more than enough ship to do the job. Gives you plenty of room for error. And so here comes Jool, so we can kind of see it there, spinning into view in the distance. As we get closer and closer, we'll start to see the moons, and now that we're in its sphere of influence, I can start doing the science, take all the science readings. And I just sort of sped all this up here, so you don't have to painfully see it. And then we're in Tylo's sphere of influence now, so just going through all the science stuff again. We're not going to get close enough to Tylo to get science from space near, but I also noticed, look at that view. That's a beautiful view there of all three of Jool's large moons, Tylo, Vall, and Lathe, all lined up there in front of the giant gas planet. So yeah, I'm just checking the maneuver that will get us into a Vall orbit. And then I figured, well, we should probably just go ahead and do a little bit of a mid-course correction there before we actually get to Vall, to put us into a low orbit. So just getting that lined up here. And not too bad at all, about 400 and some meters per second to get into a circular orbit, which is much better than if you're going to some place like Eeloo, where typically when you get to Eeloo, you have to burn well over 1,000 meters per second, sometimes upwards of 2,000 meters per second, depending on how efficient your encounter is, just to get into an orbit. And sometimes you can avoid some of that by actually going to Jool first and using a Jool assist, typically involving Tylo again, to first match orbits with Jool, which then means your orbit with respect to Eeloo is much closer, and so you end up not having to do as big of a burn once you get there. But if you just go straight from Kerbin to Eeloo, then typically you have a huge burn in order to get captured at Eeloo, because it's such a small planet. I want to say that Eeloo is actually smaller than Vall, I think. I think it's smaller than Vall. I think Eeloo only requires about 600 and some meters per second to get into orbit from the surface, whereas Vall takes about 800, a little over 800 maybe. So yeah, Eeloo's quite a small sphere of influence and can be tricky to get into an orbit. So here we are, just burning into a circular orbit at Vall. Not too bad at all. Again, I just had to kind of guess on the burn time because the readings are not cooperating. And here we are. So now we have about a 50-kilometer orbit, not quite. I'm getting some science from space near Vall. And keep in mind with the science instruments, so when you're in space low over a body, whatever that might be, it's different heights for different celestial bodies, but whenever you're in space low over, then typically the repeatable things are the Gravioli unit and actually your EVA report. So you can do both of those over each biome and they will give you more science, whereas the rest of the instruments like the temperature, the pressure and crew report, those sorts of things, they only give you science for space near, so you don't get it per biome. But with those other two you do. So do crew reports and do the Gravioli unit and you'll get quite a bit of extra science by just flying over all the biomes that you can reach in your orbit. So here I've got Valentina on the lander and we started our descent burn down to the surface of Vall. So Vall is a icy planet. It's the second planet of Jool. So it's in between Lathe and Tylo as far as orbits. And it is the smallest of the three large moons of Jool. Jool has two other moons, but they're very small, Pol and Bop, that are on fairly inclined orbits relative to the others. And they are quite small. They're roughly Minmus sized, I'd say. I think they're both a little bit smaller than Minmus, perhaps. Maybe not. Bop might be larger than Minmus, but they're in the same general vicinity. So here I'm just kind of taking a look to see about how long is it going to take for me to get brought to a stop, if I can here. The thing about Vall, it's a little bit harder to land on than the Mun. It requires, I think, a little bit more delta V. So you need to be a little bit careful when coming in that you don't, if you have a low thrust to weight ratio engine like the Terrier I have here, then your burn needs to be quite long in order to slow down properly. You can see we've already done a fairly sizable descent burn and we still have over 700 meters per second left to burn off before we hit the ground, and you definitely want to do that before you hit the ground, or you'll find that the ground will do it for you very violently. So so I'm kind of looking here and seeing we can probably land, just after this little bit of mountain range here. Looks like there's a bit of a valley there. So I kind of aimed for that, ended up coming up a little bit short, so we're on a bit of a slope when I came down and landed, but it wasn't anything too bad. You can see we're coming down here. So Vall is an icy moon, supposed to be. That's got that bluish color to it. It's supposed to be ice cold. You can see here we're coming down, getting down below 50 meters per second, coming in for the landing. I've sped this up so it's not moving quite this fast when I was actually playing. And usually I try to aim to come down to a stop and land at a little bit less than 1 meter per second if possible. And there we are, touchdown on the surface of Vall. And you can see there on a little bit of a slope, but nothing our landing legs can't handle. And of course, we'll have to do the science. Now, if you are actually doing a science save and you have not unlocked the entire tech tree and you are trying to get as much science as you possibly can here, then I would recommend actually taking Bob down to the surface, Bob Kerman, because he's a scientist, or some other scientist Kerbal that you might have conscripted to your cause earlier on, because they can reset the Science Junior unit there and the Mystery Goo canister. So scientist Kerbals can reset those so that you can use them again. So the idea would be you touch down here, you do all the science, you fall off of your craft like that, and then once you're done and have planted your flag and gotten the surface sample and everything, you can get back in and fly to another biome. And then when you get to that biome, you kind of repeat the same thing. But in my case, like I said, I've already got everything unlocked, so it wasn't a big deal for me. I was just kind of trying to land and then be done. And we look up and see, oh, look at that. Kind of a nice view of Jool and Lathe there, just over the horizon. Beautiful view there from the surface of Vall. Sometimes you just have to take a moment to enjoy the sights on something like this. So Valentina will, of course, plant the flag of my space agency here. And we have Valentina on Vall. So with that, I think we have about 2,000 something meters per second left just in this lander. So it would be more than possible to go visit at least one other biome, perhaps 2 or 3 even, before heading back to orbit. But I figured, it'd be basically the same thing over and over. It's not really anything new, so might as well just get back up to orbit. So I'm just going to wait here until the parent craft kind of orbits around so I can match it a little bit more easily and get a rendezvous a little bit quicker. So here comes the transfer stage. So here's about where we'll start the ascent. And here we go. We're heading off. We're just on that 90-degree header. That's how I'm orbiting above, so we'll match about the same heading. You can see that bit of a ridge line there. I kind of pitched up at the beginning about 30 degrees there just to make sure I would clear that ridge, and then sort of flattened it out. When you have a moon or a planet that has no atmosphere, like Vall, then the most efficient way to get into orbit is to burn straight along the ground as much as possible without actually impacting the ground. It's that horizontal speed that actually puts you into an orbit, not vertical speed. In terms of the fuel usage, that's the most efficient way. So there you can see the orbital line slowly creeping along there. Like I said, a little bit more fuel required to get into orbit than, say, the Mun. And definitely much, much, much more than Minmus. And as the orbit comes up here, we'll see the intersection, or the intersection markers appear. And it looks like we're going to be a little bit ahead, actually, a little bit ahead of the transfer stage. So I just kept burning out a little bit there so that we get the second rendezvous by going up into a little bit of a higher orbit there, which means we'll be going slower relative to the target craft, so it will catch up since we're a little bit ahead of it. You can see it up there, that little marker box. And now we just have to sort of wait until our rendezvous. And I sort of zoomed in here and noticed, oh, it looks like those orbital lines are not quite on top of each other, so we can just turn normal and do a little bit of a tiny burn to get us a little bit closer. You can just watch the separation distance there. You just kind of want that to be as low as possible. And I got it under 1 kilometer, which isn't too bad. And bringing it down there now, 0.2 kilometers. That'll work out just fine. And it'll also tell you there, when you mouse over it, what your relative speed will be with respect to the target once you reach that point. And so you'll know about how much delta V you'll need to burn in order to bring yourself stationary relative to the target. So there's the transfer stage coming on up here. Just point retrograde relative to the target. Pretty simple docking maneuver. And the more observant among you might be noticing, but Gon, look, you attached those decouplers way back in the vehicle assembly bay onto this lander, and you haven't even detached the fuel tanks. To which I would say, you are correct. And that was just something that occurred to me at the time that would improve the overall delta V performance of the craft, but I didn't really end up needing, and didn't think I would need in the first place. But you can do that. A little bit more useful on planets that have an atmosphere, like say Duna, where you want to reduce your atmospheric drag on the ascent and you're trying to keep your fuel budget as low as possible. Then you can have decouplers or just extra stages on your landing craft that you can ditch as you're ascending when you don't need them anymore. And that just maximizes your delta V efficiency, but here it just wasn't really necessary. So here we are coming in for the rendezvous with the transfer craft. And just slowing down relative to the target, so then we can go ahead and have them point at each other with the docking ports. Just the usual rendezvous procedure, nothing too fancy right here. And there they are, pointed at each other. Now we can just coast in for a nice easy docking. No problem at all. Now you notice I put that antenna on the lander. I didn't really need to do that. But if you were taking Bob down to the surface, you might want to have an antenna on your lander, one that can reach either to a relay antenna on your orbiting craft or all the way back to Kerbin directly. Because Bob cannot make maneuver nodes on his own. He needs a connection to the Kerbal Space Center to do that. So a transmission antenna can be good for that, if you want to be able to make maneuver nodes while you're handling the lander craft. But since Valentina is a pilot, she can just make maneuver nodes on her own, so it wasn't a big deal in this case. The other option being, if you wanted to have a slightly larger lander, you could include a 2-person capsule and just put both of them in there. You could have a scientist and a pilot. Now that's very important there, what you saw, so make sure that you take a Kerbal on EVA and then remove all of your science experiments from the lander and put them in the main pod that will be landing back on the planet, because unfortunately, as you can see here, we'd have to ditch the lander. At this point, it's just extra weight, and we're not going to need it getting back to Kerbin. So we're just going to deorbit it. So I just did a retrograde burn there to get our periapsis below the surface of Vall and detach the lander. So it will crash onto the surface and again not leave any orbital debris. And then we can get ready for our return back to Kerbin. So I sort of thought at first, maybe I would try for a Tylo encounter, but it just wasn't really looking like it was going to happen properly. It was going to throw me out onto a wrong angle. So I just came around and did a direct ejection from Jool from Vall. I just sped this footage up a bit here, just me playing around with maneuver nodes till I could get the right thing. You also might notice the transmission line there bouncing around. I have a few satellites in orbit around Jool, a few communication satellites. It's a nice addition. So if you have extra satellites like that, then you might have an easier time communicating back to the KSC. I just put those there for that very purpose. In case you're on the wrong side of a planet or something, you should hopefully always be able to see one of those communication satellites. Leave a comment down below if you want me to do a tutorial to show you how to set up sort of a triangular satellite formation or in orbit. I can certainly do that. It's not too difficult, requires a little bit of math, but let me know if that would be something you'd like to see in the future. So here we are, we've just kind of matched up with the orbit of Kerbin a little bit here, and then just have to play around with the maneuver nodes until we get something that allows us to get a decent encounter with Kerbin. You kind of have to pull the maneuver node out a little bit to get it to show you the correct encounter markers, and sometimes you'll have to advance it a couple of orbits to get that. So there we go, finally got ourselves an encounter. It'll be after an extra orbit here. So you can see we're going back around before doing the burn. And then just a little burn there to correct the inclination. And then we can come back down to periapsis to sort of reduce our orbit and actually get our Kerbin encounter. So when you're doing normal and anti-normal inclination corrections, it's better to do them as far out toward apoapsis as possible because you're going slower at apoapsis. And so when you burn to change your inclination, you get more of an effect. It's a greater percentage of your overall velocity. So you can make a bigger difference in your inclination when your overall orbit is slower. So you can see here I was seeing that the orbit was coming in quite quick, the orbital line there. So one trick you can do is set all of your engines to the minimum thrust, to 0.5% thrust, and that allows you to get very precise burns for these huge orbits where a burn happens, years before the actual encounter point. And that can throw things off a bit. So I figured, what you could do is I have a big enough heat shield on this capsule that I could probably just drop straight into Kerbin's atmosphere at, say 25,000 meters or so, and just come down onto the surface with an air brake. But I figured, we've got like 2,000 meters per second left in this thing, so why don't we just use our fuel to capture back at Kerbin, and then we can make sure we land on the right side of the planet where it's light, so we don't land in the dark. So that's exactly what I did here, is I just used the obscene amount of fuel that we still have in this craft to get into a proper orbit of Kerbin, and then just playing around with the maneuver node here to make sure we come into the atmosphere on the light side of the planet so it's easier to see everything. And just detached the capsule and coming right on in here. So we're not even going too fast. Just end up landing in the water here, a little bit outside that continent there. And I just slowed the video back down here to normal speed so we can watch the final descent and splashdown. Although I'm still using time acceleration because otherwise this would just take minutes watching the craft come to a final stop. And you can see we're only going 5.5 meters per second with those 3 parachutes, so it gets a little bit tedious. So I just turn on some time acceleration, and here we come down toward the surface of the water. Just kind of slowing down the time acceleration and get it back to real time here as we come down for the final 50 meters or so. And that about wraps this mission up. But one other thing we can do is check out how much science we got. So we got science from Jool, Tylo, and of course Vall, and landing on Vall's surface. Only one biome, but did all the science kits. And that has netted us a nice 4,896 science. Not too bad for a mission where, I could have certainly gotten quite a bit more science if I'd gone to another biome or two. But as it was, I think we did quite well. So, with that wraps this mission up. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Give a like or drop a comment below, and I will see you in the next video.